This episode is dedicated to Travis West, Phil Liao, Chelsea Frankel, and Michael D. Golar for becoming our newest Southpaw supporters and helping to make this project possible. The Southpaw podcast and project is supported entirely by listeners like you. If you want to support the work that we do, please leave us a 5-star review wherever you listen. Share these episodes, follow us on social media. If you're a new listener, make sure to click subscribe. And if you really want to support this project, then become a paid monthly subscriber on patreon.com/southpawpod. If you head over to Patreon and subscribe for just $4 a month, you will get immediate access to our complete catalog of bonus episodes, videos, and articles. The more supporters we have, the more time we can dedicate to the show, which means more bonuses, such as classic fight commentary, transcripts of interviews, building a liberation martial arts online curriculum, and most important of all, hire and pay for staff. If you can't support us monthly, you can also do one-time donations at ko-fi.com/southpawpod. We also have t-shirts and sweatshirts to not only flex the show, but your own moral compass. By supporting us, you're not only helping us grow, you're also helping us stay and keep this project running. We can't exist without your support. Thank you.
This is Sam.
This is Avery.
And this is Fight Study.
Today on Southpaw, we have Averi Clements. Averi is most famous for covering the sport of Brazilian jiu-jitsu. I want to say she may be the most recognizable name in BJJ writing, but she also covers mixed martial arts. We're going to dig into her career in BJJ media and also preview UFC 263. Thank you for being on the show, Averi.
Oh, Sam, thank you so much for having me. It's a huge honor.
So how did you get into martial arts and eventually into writing about Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and MMA?
I actually first started when I was living in Costa Rica. So that was about 9 years ago. And I was in a taxi, and the taxi driver tried to get a bit handsy with me. And I think I always thought it was the next day. I think the next day I stepped into a MMA gym, and I expressed interest. And I think it was a couple weeks afterward that I decided that I wanted to really get the ball rolling and sign up. So I started in kickboxing, and I did that for a few months. And then I gave jiu-jitsu a try a few months after that. And I don't know if there was ever a moment that I felt like I got bitten by the jiu-jitsu bug, where I was like, oh, I'm obsessed with this. I just kind of started going and enjoyed it enough that I never really stopped. And eventually that obsession just kind of grew. And now I pretty much only do jiu-jitsu, but I've thrown striking back into the mix a bit as well.
What were you doing in Costa Rica?
I was initially, what was I doing? I was teaching English. I got TEFL certified. So teaching English as a foreign language, and I started doing that. So I did that for about a year, and then I started my writing career, and that made more money than teaching. And so I was able to stay there, and I eventually started dating someone down there. And it was pretty much just training and writing for a few years.
It's interesting how a lot of people, when they first start martial arts nowadays, they start at an MMA gym. And whatever they start taking first, maybe it's not even an MMA class. Like you, they start in kickboxing. And for others, I've seen people where they start in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. But the first thing they start out with is not the thing they stick with. I know a lot of people who started in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I would say most of the people who are obsessed with Muay Thai, I know, started actually in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and then they fell in love with Muay Thai. For you, you started in kickboxing first and then got drawn into Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. So oftentimes it's like the first art you try isn't going to be the one that draws you in. And I think that's something for people to remember, that It's not permanent. You don't have to think of it like a marriage where you're like, okay, I have to, from day one, do all the research and figure out the martial arts I'm going to love. No, you just try it and then you try different arts and then you see the one that speaks to you.
Yeah, exactly. And I think my journey with that was, I guess, interesting for me because I actually wanted to start doing Krav Maga because, I knew nothing. I just wanted to do self-defense. I wanted to, not get assaulted. And that didn't match up with my work schedule. And so I started kickboxing. And so starting jiu-jitsu after that and kind of, I guess, entering the sphere for the purpose of self-defense and kind of finding kickboxing instead. And then finding another martial art that, I didn't even know existed. I was one of those people that was like, oh, jiu-jitsu, basically karate, and to find out that it wasn't that, but it was actually very practical for someone my size and learning how, I remember the first time I submitted somebody who is well over twice my weight and seeing how that in itself could be practical and how I kind of stumbled into a more, I guess, practical self-defense-ish martial art. I thought that was really cool as well. I think it was a good moment for me to really see how many different types of martial arts were there. Because I really just thought it was all, taekwondo or, karate, all the more striking based arts. So I think it was really neat for me to see that as well.
And that's another point I bring up often when I talk to people who've never trained anything and they're trying to find a martial art is about what's practical. Mm-hmm. And I don't mean practical self-defense. I don't mean it the way a lot of like macho dude bros in martial arts are talking about, like the best way to kill somebody.
Yeah.
I mean practical as in like the regular common term, what's practical to your life. So meaning when somebody's talking about what martial arts should I take, Sam, I tell them, what's your work schedule?
Yeah.
And then look around you. What's the schedule of classes? So a lot of times the martial arts you start training with might be what you can afford, first of all. Mm-hmm. And secondly, what works around your schedule. And then preference is after that. It's the same way as work. A lot of people, the job they do is the one that they can do.
Yeah, exactly.
Living in, not in a meritocracy, but, you got to do whatever you got to do. Then you look at the choices you have within that, right? For a lot of people, CEO is out of the question, right?
Yeah.
So it's like out of the jobs I can get, what amount of leeway do I get here? And I think martial arts is the same way. You're already restricted by your schedule, your life, your finances. And then from there, you have to kind of choose from within that. So for you, it kind of happened around happenstance and also your schedule dictated what you ended up in.
Yeah, exactly. And it just so happened that I don't think I was suited for kickboxing, not from like a, fun hobbyist perspective, but, really getting into it. Like my brain didn't really wrap itself around it as much as it did with jiu-jitsu. And so I think there's something to be said there as well for, find what works for your learning style and what works for not only your likes and dislikes, but, what you feel most comfortable in, I guess. I don't think you should try one martial art and say, oh, this isn't for me. I tried jiu-jitsu and I didn't enjoy it as much. I couldn't learn it as easily, but I tried, Tang Soo Do, and that was much better for me. So yeah, I think people should just give it a try. If something isn't for you on the first go, try something else.
And with gyms that offer a variety of martial arts or an MMA gym, usually on the schedule, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is offered the most. Like a kickboxing class might be offered 3 times a week or maybe once a day, whereas Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, you might see 3 times in a day. So that means that not necessarily that it fits your schedule better, but more like even when you take other classes, the class before or right after might be Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. So you see it and then it looks so bizarre to anything you're used to. You're like, well, what is that? And it grabs your curiosity. So kickboxing or a lot of martial arts that are taught in an MMA gym is time-wise always adjacent to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Not that Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu can then like pull you into their art, but more like it makes you aware that it exists.
Exactly. Yes.
So how did you get into writing about Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and MMA?
Yeah, so I started off in when the whole viral craze kind of started to hit with, you won't believe what happened next. And so that was actually how I got my start in writing online, which is always funny to me.
So not Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu per se, but just writing online.
Yeah, exactly. And so then I got started in jiu-jitsu. I met another jiu-jitsu writer, Emil Fisher, at a tournament when I was visiting Pennsylvania. So I was competing, and we got to chatting, and he asked what I did for a living, and I told him, and he's like, "Oh, I write for this website called the Jiu-Jitsu Times. I can, introduce you online to Kit Canaria, who runs it." I said, "Oh, that would be great." And so I started out just kind of writing articles here and there. And then over time, the previous managing editor left to pursue other things. He has a family, and I was still just working from home and writing online. And yeah, Kit asked me if I wanted to do this a bit more, and I said yes. And so that really kicked things off. And so I've since written for a few other websites, and I've stuck with Jiu-Jitsu Times pretty much the entire time. Kit's always been great to me, and so. But yeah, it's been a really fun ride since then.
When you get into Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu writing, is there any type of like coaching or mentoring from the editor's side, or is basically whatever you bring as a writer is what you got? And so then we might see a wide range of writing abilities from pretty good to pretty awful.
That's a really good point that I've never really thought of before. But yeah, you're exactly right. I don't feel like I got a whole lot of coaching, and that wasn't anything bad with, any of the other writers or editors. There's just not a lot of jujitsu journalism out there. And it's obviously not a very lucrative career. You kind of have to be either really hustling and making more money on the side, or, you might get really lucky and find somewhere that pays really well. But for the most part, it's kind of you figuring things out on your own, from my experience. And I try to help the other writers that come on board as much as I can. But, I'm not professionally trained as a writer or a journalist, so I am also perpetually winging it. But yeah, you do really get a wide range of, some people are really good at jujitsu, but not great at writing, or some people are amazing writers, but they're white belts, and that's not a bad thing. They'll continue to grow in their jujitsu journey, but they may not be at that point yet where they can write an article that articulates what they would want to say, or that would deliver the point across to someone who's a bit more advanced in jujitsu. So I think that's the most frequent problem I see, is kind of an imbalance between writing style and jujitsu knowledge. So yeah, it's an interesting mix of people you get in the industry.
Did you do any sports writing prior to that, or this was your first entry into anything related to sports?
No, this was my first type of sports writing ever. It was kind of funny because my first writing job I actually got, it was, I think, Ronda Rousey's first UFC fight was coming up, and I did an article about that, and like how exciting it was that, oh, we finally have a woman competing in the UFC. And I was a white belt at that time. But yeah, so that's how I got my first, like, that viral writing job that had nothing to do with sports, but that was really it. Like, I had never really had an interest in sports before, except for in high school. I really wanted to be like the sports writer for our high school newspaper. But yeah, that was really it.
Did you end up reading, let's say, certain sports writers, maybe not necessarily even in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, but for ESPN or other outlets that you started, maybe not even a specific person, but just reading articles to kind of get a sense of like, this is how it's done in other bigger sports?
Yeah, I don't think I had any specific journalists that I was really following looking back, but I definitely read a lot of the MMA blogs, and I still do, like, ESPN, Bloody Elbow, MMA Junkie, all those blogs and websites. And that really helped, especially for event coverage.
Mm-hmm.
Just getting kind of the flow for, okay, like, here's how you give like a play-by-play write up, or here's how you cover these things. So yeah, I don't know if I had a specific journalist that I was following, but I definitely wanted to learn more about how the sport was covered, because you're watching it and you see what's going on, but putting that on paper, or on a screen, whatever, is an entirely different skill.
Yeah. Even if you're a good writer quote unquote, in a general sense, right? Like, let's say you're even an English major or you did a lot of writing as far as essays or did well in school for that, or even got a postgraduate degree in it. It's not necessarily the same skills you would need for mixed martial arts or any combat sports, because a lot of covering combat sports, and I'm including Brazilian jiu-jitsu, you have to put into words physical things you're seeing. So there's a part of the writing that's describing movements and techniques, right? You're giving like a verbal or written play-by-play. Even if your article isn't, a play-by-play thing, you have to add some of those elements. And I don't think any writing class really prepares you for that. You have to just learn from reading other people who are doing it. And you're like, oh, that's how you do it. And that's how you kind of mix it into the paragraph.
Yeah. One of the biggest challenges that I have and that I still have, like I'm obviously always learning. But there's so much repetition in MMA and jiu-jitsu, in terms of, like how many different ways are there to say he punched the other guy, and when that happens over and over and over again, and especially in those matches where, nothing else is going on, or like, oh, they just, fought for grips the entire time. How do you make that not even just exciting? Like making it exciting is like a whole extra step, but like creating enough content to have an article that wasn't just they fought for grips for 5 minutes, the other guy pulled guard and time ran out. So that has definitely, I think, been a challenge that I don't really anticipate and that you may not find in other sports as much.
We all go through a honeymoon phase in BJJ where we think it's utopia. I call this the cult period. Some stay in the cult, and for others, the scales start to fall from their eyes. So when did the scales start to fall for you?
That is such a good question. And I think about it all the time, actually. And I have a hard time picking a specific moment, but I think it happened somewhere between blue and purple belt. And again, I don't think it was like a specific, like, oh man, the sport isn't what I thought it was. I thought it was this beautiful, amazing place where, everybody's equal on the mats. And I think that culty phase for me was like at its peak around probably like early to mid blue belt. But I think it was when I started getting closer to my purple belt. And actually when I started getting more known in the jiu-jitsu writing sphere, that I think I kind of started to see, I guess, the worst of some of the behaviors in martial arts. At least, and I shouldn't even say the worst, because like I obviously have not seen the worst or experienced the worst of it. But I think that's when I started to see like, oh, there's, there are a lot of creepy people in this sport. There's a lot of sexism, like all the things that would directly affect, I guess, a woman in the sport, specifically me, a white woman in the sport. And I think when I was a bit into my purple belt, that's when I started to see some of the even uglier things, like the racism, the homophobia, transphobia, like all the phobias and isms, that are unfortunately really prevalent in the art. And I don't even think that came from the specific behaviors of certain people, but from the complicity, of the people surrounding them. I would say, hey, I don't think it's a good idea to have this person for a seminar. Like, they've said this thing or done this thing. And the person would reply like, oh, but they're really nice. And be like, I'm like, well, yeah, they are really nice, but like, they also did this.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, but like, they were so cool. Like we had dinner and they were really chill. Like, yeah, they're super chill. They're super friendly. They're super nice. They also did this thing. And they just like didn't care. And I think seeing the prevalence of that and seeing that, as I started to put articles out about that and how the response was to that, and just reading through comments and just being like, how are there this many people in the sport that are so comfortable being vocal about supporting these people? It just blew my mind a bit. And so I think that's when, like you said, those scales started to fall off my eyes.
So it sounds like a combination of factors where really at purple belt, you've been in, I'm not even talking technical. I'm talking about just, again, going back to what's practical. You've trained the art long enough. So you've had enough time in the art where you've met enough people.
Mm-hmm.
Like by blue belt, like 10 people,
Mm-hmm.
and they all are other blue belts. and they all love it just as much as you. And then there's white belts that remind you of how you were when you came, and they're just as fascinated. So you could live in this kind of bubble. By purple belt, you've not only trained long enough where you've met a lot of people that have come through your gym, but you've probably been to seminars, been to other schools, met people. Now your circle has grown to like hundreds of people. And so by that time, then knowing that many people, you start to hear stories. You know, if you don't know that many people, like you're a white belt's not going to hear any stories because they don't know anybody.
Yeah, exactly.
By purple belt, you know a lot of people. And so now your network is big enough where these stories start to seep in. And then your eyes start to widen and you're like, oh, if that's what happened and I heard about it 3 times, you start noticing a pattern. Then you know what it looks like. Then you start looking at your own gym or people you've known. And now that you know how to recognize the pattern, you're starting to see it's not that I was isolated from it. I didn't know how to recognize the pattern, but I'm seeing it here also because now I know what it looks like. I know what I'm looking for, right? So I think a lot of that happens at purple belt because that's enough years in the sport where your network should be big enough. And I think that's when you start making a choice where you're like, I want to see it or I don't want to see it. And that's where people start to get comfortable or complicit. They're already so trained to give you some justification or rationalization because they've been doing it for themselves for so long, where it's like, oh, they're so nice, right? And I think the other factor, it sounds like for you, is also your writing. Your writing and in trying to cover your sport in earnest. As a writer, you feel obligated to cover everything, the good and the bad. And you're also public facing, so people respond to you, right? So then both of those things, I think, being in the sport for long enough and writing about the sport force you to become aware of all of its problems as well. And for you to stop thinking of it, just like all of us did, that are more social progressives, that it isn't a utopia.
Yeah, exactly. And I think I hear more, I guess, horror stories than a lot of people do because people reach out to me. And so, if I cover something, like, a story about some predator, alleged predator in the sport, someone will message me and say, oh my gosh, this happened to me too at this gym. My coach did nothing about it. And I get messages like that probably at least once a week, and so it's an eye opener. And usually there's unfortunately not much I can do.
Probably the worst stories you've heard, you can't even write about it because, for one, you don't have enough details, but secondly, because you want to protect the person giving you this information. So you want to keep them anonymous and the flack you get.
Mm-hmm.
And so if somebody comes forward in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, you also want to protect them. So it sounds like then from all the stuff you hear, the stuff you're writing about is just like the tip of the iceberg. The even worse stuff you probably can't even say.
Yeah, it barely scratches the surface. Like, people will see what I write about and they say, oh my gosh, this stuff is everywhere. I'm like, you actually have no idea. It's like you said, sometimes it's a matter of keeping the other person anonymous. Sometimes it's a matter of, there's too much he said, she said, and, I would be putting myself at risk for a lawsuit, or, I'd be putting them at risk for a lawsuit, or, because we are in a combat sport where there's a lot of, unchecked egos and, violence, you worry that there will be physical retaliation against this person. They say, oh, like my partner, I'm still living with my partner and he's beating me, but the jiu-jitsu instructor won't kick him out of the gym, but I still live with him. Like, I'm not going to report on something like that where that partner can go, is living in the same house and can turn around and kill that person. So it's a little bit, I don't want to say traumatizing, but it shakes you up a bit to know just how much of this there is in the sport where, and the sport is promoted for self-defense and confidence and all these positive things. And it has so much potential to give people that, but knowing how much of this other stuff is mixed in, it's like, man, like, can I recommend this to people knowing all the bullshit that happens?
Have you ever read the book or seen the movie Girl with the Dragon Tattoo?
Oh, I read the book. I haven't seen the movie.
Well, same thing.
Yeah.
Right? It's this like world where everybody thinks it's perfect. And it's so much worse than people think. And probably for you, you see so much of the worst side of it that most people, fortunately, won't ever have to face, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it's still part of it is still there. And so I kind of compare that scales falling off moment to the feeling the characters got in that book, Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, where they're just like, I thought everything was fine. No, it's really bad. And I'm not saying it's one for one the same or it's nearly that bad, but there's incidents that people are aware of that probably is that bad. But is it indicative of the whole? Maybe not to that extent, but I would even say within not just the culture, but in the pedagogy, there's a lot of problems as well baked in.
Yeah, I 100% agree. And that's such a good comparison, by the way, with Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, because I hadn't even thought about that, but you're exactly right.
For you getting the messages, it must especially feel like that because you're like secondhand absorbing all these other traumatic stories.
Yeah. And that's why I feel, and I understand how, trauma works. I understand that it is hard to get those messages, and I'm not trying to downplay like how it feels for me, but I also feel a little, I don't want to say silly, but kind of saying like, oh, like this stuff is so upsetting to me. Like you are kind of absorbing that secondhand trauma, and like hearing that over and over and over again, it shakes you up a little bit. I'm thankful to not be in a situation like that, but it, again, just knowing that you're a part of the sport, and, knowing, like, I've recommended jiu-jitsu to people, thankfully not often, but, one or two times it's happened that I've, encouraged, a female teammate or a female friend to keep training. And then something has happened later on down the line because directly because of her involvement in jiu-jitsu or MMA. And that's also a really yucky feeling. And knowing that, it wasn't, I guess you could say, my fault for encouraging her to keep training, and that she happened to end up in this situation, with a predatory coach or, a bad teammate. But, that stuff occurs to me where just like, I know this stuff is so prevalent. Can I consciously encourage someone to train, knowing the potential for what can happen? And obviously the answer is like, yes, that those situations are still not common, but it's alarming how much it does happen.
And you mentioned some of the pushback you've gotten. Didn't you say in a tweet to me that after you wrote a certain article that you got kicked out of your gym?
Yeah. So yeah, that was, I forget the exact title, but, don't stop defending predators just because they're good at sports. And because you see that all the time. And so I wrote that article, and a couple hours later, I got a message saying that I was no longer welcome at the gym. I need to find somewhere else to train.
Was that a surprise to you, or did you kind of sense that could happen?
I had a feeling. In fact, when I got the message, I just laughed, because there was a lot of stuff that had happened at that gym that it was just so many red flags. And there was something going on at that time with another member of the gym who was having a bad experience there that I was like, man, like, I got to stick up for her. I have to say something because like she's getting screwed over. She's going to quit jiu-jitsu because of some of the behavior that's going on. And so I was going to talk to the owner, and I was kind of prepared to either get yelled at or get the boot from that conversation. And so when that message came through, I was just like, of course, like, well, that's my problem solved. And so, yeah, it's still a bummer. Like the actual coach wasn't even the one to send me the message. So he still has not spoken to me since then. I've reached out to him even just to say like, hey, thanks for everything. Even knowing that it was his decision, I just kind of wanted to keep the peace and say like, hey, thanks for everything. I don't understand why this is happening, but I respect your decision. I wish you the best. Never got a reply. So it was an interesting experience. Obviously it was for the best, but, yeah. And that article specifically wasn't mentioned, but, when I was like, hey, can I ask what brought this about? The person who replied did say like, oh, your articles. Like, you brought so much to the gym, but your articles. So I was like, okay.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
And you're in a difficult situation because you're a writer and you also train and you want to stay a writer and cover the sport and not get shut out. You have to, I guess, sometimes swallow your pride and make peace with people that you probably don't want to.
Yeah. I'm lucky that, Kit, who owns Jiu-Jitsu Times, is pretty cool when I'm like, hey, I don't want to interview this person, or, I know they're really good at jiu-jitsu, but like, I just don't feel comfortable giving them unnecessary media attention beyond like, hey, they're involved in this match or they won this match. But in the general sphere of things, there's definitely, I have to present myself a certain way and, make sure I'm getting along with certain people. And some people I'm just like, no, like, I don't care how famous or well connected you are. Like, I don't like you as a person. I think you're bad for the sport and I'm not going to give you that extra attention. But yeah, in the general sphere of things, like when that happened, when I was kicked out, like, I was really worried about how that would affect my reputation in the area, like in the local area. And thankfully it really hasn't. Like there are definitely a few gyms that were so closely connected that I'm like you probably got a different side of the story than what actually happened, or I probably wasn't painted in the best light. And if you're going to take that without reaching out and asking me about it, like that's on you, and I'm not going to try to start this, war by giving my side of the story and bad mouthing somebody. But yeah, thankfully most people, I don't want to say lucky, but I'm grateful. I'm fortunate that my reputation as a person kind of speaks for itself and that I don't have to worry about those things.
Because there is a type of blacklisting that happens in jiu-jitsu where you could be just unwelcome in a lot of gyms.
Oh yeah, 100%. And especially, when you are very connected with a certain gym, if a more well-known person, like if an upper belt gets booted from that gym, there's usually a reason why. If an upper belt leaves a gym, there's a reason why. They weren't just like, oh, I'm not feeling it anymore, like peace out. Normally there's fallout that happened there. So yeah, I'm grateful that didn't really happen in that scenario.
But with that said, would you say most of the feedback you've gotten has been more positive than negative?
Yeah. I actually think it's interesting that a lot of the really positive messages I've gotten about my writing are usually private messages. And of course, the people who are more negative about it like to be the loudest. They like to post things in public or things like that. I've gotten a few really unhinged messages from people who got really upset about things I've written like 3 years ago and just randomly decided to tell me about it at 3 a.m. their time. But for the most part, the private messages I get are really, really nice and supportive. And I tell people all the time when they get into this type of writing, I'm like, screenshot the nice things that people say, because like there have been many, many times when I've gotten so much hate for articles. Like even the one that you reposted, the one that got me kicked out, that one has gotten a lot of hate from people, which is funny because I think I thought it was a pretty, widely acceptable message, but I guess not.
It's funny that you reporting on it, that you're the one getting the hate, not the sexual predator or the people defending the sexual predators.
Oh yeah. And that always happens. Anytime I write something, about, like a predator, racism, whatever else you want to, any other negativity in the sport, I get a lot of flack for like, why aren't you reporting on the nice stuff about jiu-jitsu? Like, why do you always share such negative things? This is why people have such a bad impression of the sport, because you're giving these people attention. Like, it's just news, my dude. Like if you don't want it to be news, don't do the thing. And yeah, so it's always interesting to me, and it bums me out because like I obviously do not want to be reporting on this stuff. I would rather jiu-jitsu be sunshine and rainbows, but yeah, unfortunately, like people won't police within their own community. Maybe police probably isn't a great word, but people won't moderate within their own community and kick out these bad people themselves. And so, when this stuff happens, like of course you got to cover it. Of course, you want to make people aware of this stuff. But yeah, the nice messages that I get where people said, thank you so much for saying this, like this happened to me and nobody really talks about it, so I feel seen, or, things like that. That always, it makes my day, and it makes it easier for me to continue with this despite all the flack.
Covering that stuff, even for me, it's not fun. I know it's not fun for you. It's not something that you're like, oh, I feel so good covering about this terrible thing that I need to warn people about before they even read it.
Yeah.
And you also know the negative feedback and consequences that'll come from it. You do it because you feel compelled to do it. I do it because I feel like I have to do it. I have to say something, not because I enjoy doing it. And oftentimes I'm trying to convince myself why I shouldn't do it.
Hmm.
It's always like me telling myself like, oh, don't do it, dude. You got so much flack the last time, but it's like they present it as if we're doing it because we like doing this,
Hmm.
that it's somehow fun or enjoyable, when it's doing it because you feel morally compelled to do it.
And that's, what I've told people a lot. And people have even come up to me in person, not so much recently, but previously. I've had people come up to me and be like, why did you cover this? Like, this is not, this doesn't paint our sport in a good light. And it's like, well, at the same time, like you have to cover it, especially like if it's news, if it's a big story in the sport, and it's not even for the sake of like, oh, more clicks, bad story equal more clicks. But more just like it happened. It's a big deal. And I think people should know about it. And I feel a lot of times like sick writing about some of this stuff, even when it's not about a specific story, when it's just about, just accumulation of things that it kind of comes out and turns into an opinion piece. I don't enjoy it. It doesn't make me feel nice. But like you said, like you want to make the sport better for people, and you want to make people aware of what's going on. So it's got to be covered.
They're literally asking you to cover up the truth. They don't want news or the truth. They want propaganda, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's such a weird, bizarre feedback when you get that. It's like, what? What do you want me to do? You want me to lie to you and pretend that things are this make-believe world? And often people who ask you to do that are the same people who always project to everything else that they're doing propaganda. It's the social justice warriors doing propaganda. It's like socialism doing propaganda.
Yep.
When these same kind of right-facing people are asking us to do propaganda, right? So
exactly. Like, oh, the mainstream media is evil. They're covering things up. They're lying to us. But like, you want me to lie to you? You think that's the best use of my time in my my little apartment with my little jiu-jitsu writing job? Is that the best use of my time?
Did you start covering MMA the same time you started writing about BJJ, or did that happen later?
I think it was when I started taking on more of an editor role at Jiu-Jitsu Times, because these days I generally do 3 or 4 articles a day, and there's not so much news in the jiu-jitsu world to cover that amount. And so I've started doing more MMA as a result of that. And because MMA is generally more, I hate to say it, but like click worthy. And so I did it more out of necessity. I enjoy MMA much more passively than I enjoy jiu-jitsu. Like I think I mentioned to you before, I don't follow it super, super closely, unless there's a fighter that I have like an emotional attachment to. I really want to see them win, or I know them personally, so I follow their career. But yeah, I think that happened, I want to say like a year and a half, 2 years into my jiu-jitsu writing, that I started covering a bit more of that.
Since you inhabit both worlds, BJJ and MMA, would you say they're different, or would you say it's the same world?
That's a great question. I think there are a lot of similarities in terms of the online culture. Like a lot of jiu-jitsu people, there's a lot of crossover in MMA. I think the main differences would be jiu-jitsu also has kind of that, I guess, that more traditional culture entwined within it. Not so much, I guess, in the more no-gi oriented sphere, but the people who are big, IBJJF purists, I feel like there's a bit more of that in the jiu-jitsu sphere. But again, I'm not so deeply entrenched in the MMA world that I can confidently say that doesn't exist in MMA as well. I'm sure it does. But yeah, I see a lot more of the illusion that jiu-jitsu is all about like honor and respect and, all those things that you hear when you first start jiu-jitsu, what you assume it is as a martial art. I see a lot more people really clinging to that in jiu-jitsu, where I think a lot of MMA and, and I guess more no-gi sub-only jiu-jitsu, there's a lot of people who are just big on, the violence of it. And they enjoy that a bit more, and they're a bit more okay with it being rough around the edges. So I think that's the biggest difference I've seen.
Which do you prefer covering?
definitely jiu-jitsu, because I understand it a bit more. And I'm not as enthusiastic about the MMA side, ironically. I know a lot of people are like, oh, there's more punching and kicking in MMA, it's more action, more blood. And I'm just like, it's a sport. I'm not as emotionally invested in it. I like to watch things that I understand better and that I do and that I'm interested in doing. And I tried training for an MMA fight. I cracked a rib doing it, and I decided that I wasn't so in love with it that I wanted to keep going with it to that extent. Whereas jiu-jitsu, I continuously love it, with a few hiccups here and there. So I think I definitely enjoy covering jiu-jitsu a bit more.
So it sounds like a lot of it is also, a lot of the players that you're covering, whereas with MMA, they're more like abstract, just athletes that you have to cover.
Yeah, for sure. And I have gotten to interview a few really cool MMA fighters. I recently did a long interview with Kayla Harrison, and that was really awesome. And she was such a fun athlete to interview. And so moments like that, I kind of get my little fangirl moment in where I'm like, oh, this is an athlete I actively wanted to cover, and I got to interview her. I got to cover her fight. And that's always really exciting for me. So I do definitely have those moments of really enjoying covering MMA. But I think in jiu-jitsu, I mean, how jiu-jitsu puts you in closer proximity to a lot of these athletes. It's like covering basketball and being able to go play basketball with Michael Jordan, and so I think in jiu-jitsu, that is one thing that is really cool about jiu-jitsu, is that you can just go take a seminar from somebody and, maybe, like I've gotten to interview Michelle Nicolini through a seminar, and I know she does MMA now as well. But yeah, I think just that proximity of getting to know so many jiu-jitsu athletes as people to some extent, it has been really cool. And I think that's one of the things I enjoy most about covering jiu-jitsu.
Yeah, that is a key distinction. Even though I kind of consider MMA a semi-pro sport, because you're not getting paid like basketball players or football players or even like the same level boxers.
Yep.
But with MMA, there's a lot of people who will never have trained or sparred with, any of these like top MMA athletes. Because even if you're at the same gym, they have a different class or a different training for them, whereas for pros only, right? Whereas in jiu-jitsu, there's no pros only. Maybe it's starting to form and it happens here or there, but for the most part, if you are at a gym, you'll train with all the pros. You can train. Like, it's not weird to say, oh, I rolled with Marcelo Garcia. It's like, yeah, that's understandable in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Whereas if you say you sparred with John Jones, that would be really unusual because he's not going to just spar with just anybody, right?
Yeah, exactly.
A note to our loyal listeners. If you love the show, please support us and help us get paid for our labor by joining Team Southpaw on Patreon. By becoming a member, you'll get access to bonus content like exclusive articles, fight previews, bonus episodes, transcripts of fight studies, and access to our private chat group on Discord. But more importantly, you will help us supplement the cost of the show, the incredible time and energy Sam and I put into making the show, and you'll be giving us some breathing room not only to juggle Southpaw with our day jobs, but also expand Southpaw into other areas. Show your Southpaw solidarity by supporting us at patreon.com/southpawpod.
Yeah. And I guess going back to your question about, some of the differences between jiu-jitsu and MMA, I do think that in itself is a big difference. And even like when you see some of these high level MMA guys, they a lot of the time they don't really want to roll with just your average jiu-jitsu person, and that's completely fair. Like, this is how they feed their family. Like, I would not want to be rolling with a white belt who just wanted to Americana me from guard, if that's what I needed to do to make money. But yeah, I do think jiu-jitsu, when you're just doing jiu-jitsu, you're a lot more accessible even at the highest level, as a training partner, as a rolling partner. So I always find that very interesting.
Yeah. And it comes with this pros and cons. I think because it is so exclusive in MMA, you're not going to get the same hero worship or cult of personality in an MMA gym because you're separated from that MMA fighter. So I think they have less access to be a potential predator. Whereas with Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is the good and the bad. That proximity, that accessibility is cool, that it's a little bit more flattening and you could train with whoever, but that cult worship will still exist. And so then they could be in a position where they might wield that power in an inappropriate way. And now they have access to victims as well. So I think we've seen both sides of that, the good aspect of that permeability and the bad aspect.
Yeah. And I think one aspect of that as well, that I've seen a lot of, and this is kind of, again, going back to your question of like, when did those scales start to fall off? I think when I was an earlier blue belt and I was getting to meet all these big name athletes and, I was getting started in my jiu-jitsu writing. So a lot of people wanted to talk to me because they wanted, to make their names even bigger. I started to see, or I guess I started to have like my own little fangirl moment of like, these are the top people in my sport and like, they want to talk to me. What? Like they're being nice to me. And I think a lot of people get that as well. And that's another downfall of that proximity. You go take a seminar from somebody and, they're nice to you and they take a photo with you. And so you're like, oh, they must be a good person. And a lot of these people are like, oh, I took a seminar with such and such and now I'm ready to defend them to the death online. Like even though they said that, homeless people should die or whatever else. And so I think that's another downfall is you meet somebody and you have enough proximity to them to be like, oh, I've rolled with them a couple times, but, they don't know that person as a person. They just know them as, a brief training partner or as a, somebody who taught a seminar. And then they think they know them backwards and forwards where I think it just plays into that hero worship a bit that you mentioned.
Yeah. Cause if a white belt or just somebody your level, just a regular person who trains Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu as a hobby, if they're nice to you, it's not going to stand out in your mind because they're supposed to be nice. Like normal people should be nice to each other. Whereas if somebody you elevate or have hero worship over, if they act even a little bit nice to you, you put a magnifying glass on it. You highlight it in your memory. So it stands out so much more when it should be the same. Like people being nice to each other should be normal, but you treat that normal, just kind of social convention as being exceptional. And then you use that and put it under this magnifying glass to say, see, this is proof how great they are and how nice they are. And everything you're saying about them is false. When it says more about our expectations and really about how strong that cult is, because we take what should be just normal and things we don't remember throughout the day. People are nice to us all day, just normal throughout the day. And none of it stands out. So the fact that this stands out, what has already happened? We've already been snake charmed. We've already been like, mesmerized. And that's the problem is even before they're nice, the fact that we're already willing to take anything that they do, that normal people do all the time as exceptional. And that's how we walk into the door of their seminar is already the problem. And that's what I meant earlier about the pedagogy. I think this kind of cult worship doesn't just happen because they're good at Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, but the way Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is taught, especially like a lot of the way the hazing is done, like trains us to be more susceptible to falling into that kind of cult mindset.
Yeah, I completely agree. And what I've noticed, especially looking back when I was newer in the sport and the way people would really hype up the instructors who were giving seminars. And it's so easy to be like, oh, this person was a world champion. And like, you and I know that's really cool, but like there are a lot of world champions, but you blow it up so much in people's minds, especially these newer practitioners, that they go from like, oh, I'm going to learn a seminar from somebody who's really good at the sport, someone who I can really learn from. And it gets hyped up so much in their mind to like, I'm meeting a celebrity, and to be fair, that person is kind of a celebrity in our sport, but like no one would recognize them walking down the street, you know what I mean? Unless they did jiu-jitsu. And so I think, that's another aspect of it. It gets hyped up so much. And these people who are really just ordinary people who are, a bit better at jiu-jitsu than the rest of us, they get hyped up to, like you said, this cult status, this celebrity status. And it kind of builds this weird bubble around them that it makes even newer practitioners, it makes them not want to criticize them when they come out and say stupid things or do stupid things. So it's interesting. We're in an interesting sport with interesting dynamics.
Yeah, I think the fact that it is so obscure because most people don't know what Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is, that obscurity makes people more defensive. It's like very much like gaming culture where a lot of people aren't familiar with anything about gaming. They may game, but they don't know about the culture or who some of these players are, or maybe what some of these games are. And so it makes the fan base even more protective and defensive because they know it is on the margins.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point that I haven't even thought of. But yeah, you're exactly right. And it makes me wonder, like jujitsu and gaming, how many other, I guess, sports or cultures are there out there? Like I've thought about, like, do other sports have the same dynamics as jiu-jitsu does, or is it just the nature of what we do with the combat sports and how people hype it up to be like, this is your only line of defense against somebody trying to attack you from the bushes? um, like, do other sports have that same mentality, or is it exclusive, or at least more prevalent in the martial arts world?
Yeah, I think it can look the same, but I think, let's say with major sports, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's a reason why people are talking about it because it's major. So for them, it's just an actual like obsession or like they're that much of a fan,
Mm-hmm.
a super fan. Whereas with Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu or gaming or things like that, I think it's much more to do with insecurity because you're insecure in your position and insecure of this art, that it isn't mainstream, that people do ridicule it or make fun of it. You feel like you have to double down on this. And so any slight against it then is perceived even worse. And any small thing that's good is perceived even greater.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point. And again, I think there's some, I guess, elitism because of how jiu-jitsu and other martial arts are hyped up for their self-defense purposes or
Oh, yeah.
Things like that. Like there is a sense of like, oh, I'm not just playing baseball. I'm not just learning to hit a ball with the bat. I'm learning how to kill people with my bare hands.
Yeah.
And I definitely 100% kind of fell into that trap when I was a bit, I guess you could say, younger in the sport. But yeah, there is this weird sense of elitism where, you kind of get picked up, you go to a family gathering and it's like, oh, how's your little karate thing going? But, I guess it's like that, I don't want to say like nerd mentality, but just like, oh, but like I have the super awesome skill that you don't even know about. Like, there's this weird elitism that happens with it as well.
The obscurity means that I'm better than you.
Yeah.
Because it's not for everybody. But really, we're pretending like we somehow like got selected to be in this special club when they'll take the money of anybody. They want people to come in. They want everybody to be able to sign up. So there was no like initiation process. It's not like Naruto's like ninja society where it's only for the special chosen one. It only ends up the small group because it's not that popular, not because there was some gate that kept normal humans from trying it. So I think, again, it's just all this rationalization and justification to justify that you're doing this obscure sport that isn't for everybody, that a lot of people don't find interesting.
And I'm sure a lot of it comes from the fact that, jiu-jitsu attracts a lot of people who weren't necessarily super athletic their whole lives. I wasn't, like I was bullied so bad in track that I quit and then I found jiu-jitsu. And so, yeah, I think there also comes that rush of being like, oh, nobody ever said I was going to be good at a sport, but, now I'm good at pajama wrestling. And, so yeah, it's very interesting to me to see the type of people that come in. Sometimes interesting in a bad way and sometimes in a good way.
A lot of lone wolves.
Oh, yeah.
And that's why like the wolf imagery is so popular in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, I think, because it's like people who specifically hated working with other people and hated team sports. And maybe that comes from being bullied or not. And so then because that becomes a funnel for so many of them, they also get to create and influence the culture and also have that chip on their shoulder where it's like, I'll show you, you don't even know. Now I can kill you. I can kick your ass, Mr. Bully that bullied me in junior high or high school.
Yeah. And that's always so interesting to me because there's a lot of people that come in and they use that for good. A lot of people like to say, like, oh, jiu-jitsu, will make you into a better person. And like, I don't think that's true at all. Like if you have that ugly stuff, within you beneath the surface, jiu-jitsu is going to bring that out. If you were a bully all along, then that's just going to come out, whether or not you realize you were bullied. Maybe you were bullied, but now you have that anger inside you. And now you have the physical abilities behind it to bully other people. Like that's going to come out in jiu-jitsu. But if you had a negative or a positive experience earlier in life and you now have jiu-jitsu and you use it as, something to empower other people and to use it as a tool to bring out the best in other people, like that's just as possible. But there's a lot of people who think that it's making them a better person. And all it's really doing is turning them into who they would have been if they, knew how to enact violence upon other people a bit earlier in life.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's very interesting to hear women describe Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu versus men. It almost sounds like they're describing two different things, right?
Yeah.
I think it speaks more to what they come in with and what Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is for them. So maybe for men, it's like this reinforcing of some of their more toxic traits, whereas maybe for women, it's a way to heal or liberate themselves or empower themselves, right? So I think it's something where the two groups have been speaking past each other. Maybe women are more aware that that's how men talk about it, but men are more oblivious that women talk about it differently because it means different things. I think in general, this doesn't mean everybody, but broadly.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I do feel like I don't want to say the bullying, but there is definitely negativity and elitism and superiority that comes in to the women's jiu-jitsu culture as well. It just manifests a bit differently. Like I've seen a lot of, I guess you could say, mean girl culture in jiu-jitsu. Like, obviously, at this point in my journey, I want it to be for everybody. I want to bring women in, but there was definitely a time, probably like early blue belt, when I was the highest ranked woman in my gym. And I don't think I was ever mean, but I definitely had that, I guess you could say like an instinct somewhere in me, like a little ugly voice that was just like, you've worked so hard to get here. Like, you're not going to just let any girl come into the gym and think that she can, flirt with the boys and, earn the same respect. Like, it was very, like, it was just that culture that's ingrained in a lot of women from, elementary school, from what you see in the media, just that, gatekeeping, exclusionary type of thing. And you see that a lot even now. Like, I've met female black belts that I was just like, what are you doing? Like, why aren't you happy with the fact that there are some women in your class who are like a bit more giggly or having fun, that aren't taking this as something that like, oh, like you have to be respected by the men, like they're just kind of doing their own thing and enjoying the sport in the way that they want to. Or, who cares if this woman's walking in and, maybe she's got fake nails for the time being, those will have to come off as she continues. But, like if she's a bit more, girly and feminine presenting than other women in the gym, like there's just a lot of weird gatekeeping there. And it's similar. I think the root of it is similar to the kind of bullyish, hyper masculine stuff that happens in men's jiu-jitsu culture. It just manifests very differently.
And it's still putting men at the top.
Oh yeah, exactly.
So it's still an extension of that misogyny.
100%. It's, it's either trying to fit in with the men or, saying, oh, like you have to make the men think of you a certain way. You're exactly right. Like, it's all rooted in that misogyny.
Yeah, because they're still the barometer.
Exactly. Very good point.
So let's talk about UFC 263, which is headlined by the middleweight title fight between champion Israel Adesanya and Marvin Vettori. This is actually a rematch where Adesanya won the first fight by close split decision, and there's actually a lot of rematches in this card. So what are your thoughts about Marvin Vettori, Israel Adesanya, and this fight?
I really enjoy Izzy as a personality and as a fighter. I'm really excited for it. And I think there's an interesting, I don't know if you want to say contrast, but Vettori is a, jiu-jitsu brown belt. He's got definitely more submissions, on his record than Izzy does. And I think it would be interesting to see, I think Izzy's been hyped up a lot now that he's gotten his purple belt in jiu-jitsu. I don't think he will actively want to go to the ground, but I would actually like to see what he could do from the ground. I don't think it's going to go there, but I would really like to see that happen personally.
Yeah, Adesanya has had problems with southpaws in the past, not only in his first fight with Vettori, but also with Kelvin Gastelum. that'll be interesting this time around if he's able to adjust to that, because it seemed like he had a hard time the first time around. And it's something actually going back to jiu-jitsu, people don't think about. People think that jiu-jitsu is an ambidextrous art because we drill everything both sides, but actually people do have preferences. So sometimes I'll roll with somebody and I'll say, "Are you left-handed?" And they'll be like, "You're the first person who ever asked me that." And it's like, because I'm looking for it. Because if they're left-handed, they'll attack in directions that you're not as used to. They can go both ways, because if you're high level, just like in high level wrestling, you can attack from both sides, but you could still tell a preference.
Oh yeah, 100%. And that's why I'm always, again, I'm not a big striker, but knowing how hard it is to be ambidextrous in jiu-jitsu as somebody who's not ambidextrous from the start, seeing people who can really switch up their stance in MMA just blows my mind. Like I struggle enough with left and right, when I'm just doing pad work, and to see how people can switch it up. And that's such a cool skill to have, but also just to get used to fighting someone who's southpaw when you yourself are, orthodox, I think is a crazy skill on its own.
Vettori also has a style where he doesn't bite on feints because he's constantly trying to lead and attack. And I think that's less about his strategy, but more about his personality, because everything I read and see of this guy, especially in interviews, he just seems like he has a bad temper. So instead of like, "Oh, this is a possible strike, I should cower or I should back up," he doesn't care, and he's just going to keep coming forward. And even like listening to some of his teammates talk about him, they just say that's just how he is as a person. He'll just kind of rush in and come forward without being intimidated.
Yeah. How do you think that's going to go against Israel Adesanya?
I noticed that against Jan Blachowicz, that Jan did bite on the feints, but instead of biting and like backing up or whatever, once Jan realized, "Oh, this isn't really a strike, I'm just going to come forward." And that worked really well against Adesanya. And I think Marvin Vettori, if he doesn't even have that hesitation that Jan Blachowicz had, I think he'll do even better. But with that said, Adesanya is, even without the feints, he's such an accurate striker. It might not matter.
Yeah.
Like against Paulo Costa, it didn't matter. As Paulo Costa was coming in, he just lit him up. So even if you get past the feints, you still have to deal with the accuracy of his striking.
Yeah, his striking is terrifying.
In rewatching the fight, I noticed if you completely ignore Daniel Cormier's commentary, the fight is a lot closer, especially than I remembered.
Mm-hmm.
I watched it again without the sound, especially the first round, and I'm like, wow, that's a really close round. But when I listened to it, especially from Daniel Cormier's commentary, I thought like Adesanya had clearly won and dominated, but it was not like that. And so when it went to a split decision, it made a lot more sense. Even if they're not a striker, but a lot of like fighters to martial artists. And I think you could relate to this. There's an aesthetics to martial arts, whether it's striking or grappling. So we have a soft spot. We have a bias for pretty technique.
Yeah.
So whether the technique lands or not, we remember the pretty ones more than the ones sometimes that land but don't look as pretty. And actually, Marvin Vettori is a very good striker, but it doesn't look nearly as crisp or just as elegant, let's say, because I think Israel Adesanya, just being a longer person, it almost looks like ballet. Just everything looks longer and more like bird-like, right? Like it just has this grace to it.
Yeah.
Because of that and the way he uses his length. Whereas Marvin is a little bit more like stout, and it looks a little bit more compact the way he moves, right? So if you watch that first round without the commentary and just count the strikes, they both hit each other about the same number of times. But Israel Adesanya's striking just stands out more just because, when you train martial arts, you just like those techniques more. I sometimes wonder about that with just how things are scored in general. Like when you watch even a Brazilian jiu-jitsu match and it goes to a ref's decision and you're like, how did this person win? You always think the ref is wrong. And maybe sometimes there is like bias with the refs, especially because they're part of the same association or whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
But also, what are we looking at? Like sometimes I think my teammate won, but did I think that just because they're my teammate? Or maybe it's not even a teammate. It's somebody I watch on YouTube and I really like their style.
Yeah.
So am I judging them just for style points? Like one of those things that you score just on aesthetics, like gymnastics, like you get a 10 from my card for how pretty it looked, right?
Yeah.
Fighting isn't about that. It's about effectiveness. So I think also with Adesanya, he draws in all of us, whether you're more into grappling or more into striking, draws this bias that we have where we just like pretty martial arts. And so we always think he's winning. Like with Blachowicz was outlanding him, but a lot of people didn't know that because we were just so mesmerized by Adesanya's movements.
Yeah. And I think especially for this fight, not only with the specific styles, where Vettori does appear a bit more, I guess you could say scrappy, where he's always pushing forward. His movements look a lot, he doesn't have that lankiness that Adesanya does. And like you said, Izzy is more precise. He looks just majestic. He's like this giant athletic swan. But I think people also are like, I know I'm guilty of this. Like I'm drawn to Izzy just because of, like his personality, what he projects as a fighter. He's fun to follow. He's fun to watch. And, even though Vettori does have that more like, I guess you could say aggressive personality that he kind of projects in interviews and things like that, I think there is definitely, I think a lot of people are going into this fight with bias towards Izzy. Just everything about him. He looks like an action hero. He fights like an action hero. And I think a lot of people are really, really biased towards him because of that, which may definitely come out.
When we score in our own minds watching a fight, I think that personality they project, if we like it, we put that into our calculus of scoring, right?
Mm-hmm.
And also their body language.
Mm-hmm.
Adesanya is very good at always looking like he's winning and that he believes is winning the round, right?
Yeah.
And so we start getting convinced that he was winning the round as well. I think even in the first Vettori fight, that became a factor. So let's say somehow Vettori does win. There's going to be a lot of upset people out there because if he doesn't finish, people will remember Adesanya as winning.
Yeah, that's a very good point.
Next, we have the flyweight title fight between champion Davison Figueiredo and Brandon Moreno. Another rematch. The first one was one of the rare UFC draws, but one judge did give it to Figueiredo because you could say it was a draw or you could say Figueiredo won, but it would be, I think, harder to say Brandon Moreno won. But in the first fight, the areas that he had the most success in, I think, was just cardio and volume, but also on the ground. Watching Moreno's jiu-jitsu doesn't look like MMA jiu-jitsu. It looks like watching a guy who's really high-level jiu-jitsu. Like MMA grappling has this kind of bread and butter style. It's like one or two moves, and then you go for a submission. It's kind of like double legs in MMA, where it's just a blast double, where high-level wrestlers come in and they don't just do a blast double. They're chaining stuff together.
Yeah.
And so even like some of the good grapplers for MMA, they're not chaining stuff. Whereas Moreno, he looks like a jiu-jitsu guy. He looks like somebody who could have been winning tournaments, and maybe he did.
Yeah, that was something that actually has surprised me about him. It was just how his jiu-jitsu looks so carefully planned. When you talk about thinking multiple steps ahead in jiu-jitsu, and I imagine that is so much harder in MMA when somebody's trying to punch you in the face. Like you said, that the style is just so different. And I think a lot of people, when they get to the ground, they're just thinking like, next step, survive. Okay, I've survived, now submission or whatever else. And it seems like he already has his game plan mapped out once the fight goes to the ground, which I think makes him such an interesting fighter, not just from a jiu-jitsu perspective, but just in general, because like you said, we don't see that a lot. And it always just, it looks so clean, like it looks like he just has such a plan that it just flows together so nicely when he's on the ground.
Figueiredo is much more of a club and sub guy where he kind of clubs you and rocks you and then looks for a submission.
Yeah.
I think there's a difference between being a submission artist, like somebody who's really good at the finishes, versus just being a good grappler. I know a lot of jiu-jitsu people, especially like in the lower belts, who are really good at certain submissions, like really good at triangles or arm bars, but they're not really good at recovering guard, passing guard, sweeping, any of the other stuff. They're just a submission specialist. And I think Davis Figueiredo, has more of that style of just looking for a finish rather than being able to do all the other aspects of grappling at the same high level.
Yeah.
So you cover the sport of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and so you know firsthand how much the high level sport has been evolving as far as like the way the grappling game looks, especially no-gi, and the moves that are being done, and like the grappling system itself, like the guard system, the leg lock system is all changed. So sport Jiu-Jitsu, gi or no-gi today looks very, very different than it looked 5 years ago. How much of that are we seeing filtered into MMA?
No, that's a good point. And I definitely think that a lot of what we're seeing more in sport jiu-jitsu, especially when it comes to things like leg locks, it seems like a lot of MMA fighters are a lot less hesitant to go for those now, especially when you look at, one championship. Obviously, we see people like, Gary Tonin coming into that promotion and using their jiu-jitsu skills and their submission skills in that sphere. But I think we're seeing more leg locks. I've been seeing a lot more bendy stuff, like, rubber guard in MMA. So yeah, I think, with gyms like 10th Planet, there's a lot of fighters who come from 10th Planet gyms now. And seeing how I guess that, more sport jiu-jitsu aspect is coming into it. There, I do feel like the way it's evolved is not that we're seeing less of more traditional grappling and, those fundamental submissions, triangles, arm bars, all that stuff. But I think we're also seeing a lot of fighters who are capitalizing on the fact that their opponents don't understand things like leg locks or, like I said, rubber guard, things like that. And so I think they're being a bit more creative with their jiu-jitsu, which is interesting. They're not just focusing on their bread and butter, and they're not afraid to go for, we've seen a few buggy chokes now. Things like that. I just think the creativity and the grappling side of MMA has been upped in the past few years.
Can you explain what the buggy choke is for people who don't know what that is?
Oh man, not very well, to be honest with you. But it's basically a what the heck type of choke. It happens basically from the bottom, and the other person's on top, and they usually think they're about to pass the guard, but the person on the bottom kind of grabs their own leg, and it looks very strange. It doesn't look like it should work.
But they're not in a guard position, right? It looks like more like struggling to maintain a guard or recover a guard or a desperation move.
Yeah, exactly. Like it looks like they're like, that looks how I look when I'm trying to, get out of side control and like desperately get, half guard or full guard or something. Like it looks like a transition to, I guess a different guard almost. Like it looks like they are struggling and then all of a sudden you're getting choked. So I've had it done to me a few times and I've not yet been able to do it on anybody, but
the one thing I do think that people in the past were better at was recovering guard and preventing themselves from getting mounted or escaping the mount. Whereas now people are really good at, in general, at framing and getting up and creating scrambles. But nowadays, if you mount somebody, and even if you're not like a really good Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu person, you got to mount in MMA and it's like done.
Yeah.
Whereas in the past, people didn't even like mount because people would escape so easily. They usually held side control or half guard because everybody on their first day of MMA training, even though they want to do MMA, everybody's learning hip escapes and shrimping and recovering the guard. So I think the emphasis on getting up has made people in MMA today worse at those basics that people used to be good at. Are there still people who are using half guard as much to base their whole game around, or not as much now?
I don't think you see it as much in a lot of the more, I guess, younger athletes or the up and coming athletes. I think it's definitely, you see it more in the more old school, the more, I guess the veterans of the sport. It seemed like there was like an age of half guard.
I think also because the athletes today, even in sport jiu-jitsu, are like much better trained, like not better trained in jiu-jitsu, but much better trained as athletes. So they're much better conditioned. They're doing things outside of just training Brazilian jiu-jitsu. So they're just quicker, more athletic, and also better cardio. Half guard was popular because you could just rest. You don't even need to be in that good of a shape or have excellent cardio. You could just use half guard to just slow it down and kind of have them tire themselves out and then just sweep them at the end, or sweep them and get on top, cook them from half guard top for a bit and then pass. But nowadays, I think people factor in that they have really good cardio. And so because of that, then they don't need moves like that as much anymore. They can just go, go, go.
Yeah, that's a good point. Do you think any of that comes from a desire to, I guess, like make the fight more exciting? Like, do you think people realize that if they stay in half guard too long, then they might, get scored against or anything like that?
I think, like you said, for younger people coming in, because they're much more familiar with Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and they're starting younger than before, I think people who started in their 20s needed half guard, right? A lot of the champions from the past, even the ones from Brazil, they started in their 20s. Damian Maia actually started, I think, in his 20s as well.
Yeah.
So they needed stuff like that. And also, they weren't training 2-a-days back then. You could be world champion training, once a day, maybe even 4 times a week. When I started Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, it was like 2-a-days was like, what are you, a professional athlete? You're not getting paid for this. Why would you do that? It was just absurd, right? When you have younger people getting into Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, then younger people are going to change the sport. Younger people are going to be interested in different things than older people. And so younger people aren't going to be as interested in just that old man style of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, as they call it, right? Old man Jiu-Jitsu. They're much more interested in making it like a video game, making it fast paced, making it more playful. And also, I think for them, aesthetics are much more important. They also want to have a game that's very cool, just like, when you started seeing 16-year-olds in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is when the gi started getting more expensive and cooler looking because when everybody was 25 and above in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, it didn't matter. Nobody cared about how nice or cool looking the gis were. Whereas when you had 16-year-olds now taking over the sport, you needed to cater to them. And so I think in that same way, half guard or these kind of more static style Jiu-Jitsu games that you saw in the past, those were made by older people for older people. And so I think younger people are inventing their own game and what they like. And that aesthetics is also more important for them.
Yeah, I've seen it. Again, I haven't been in jiu-jitsu for terribly long. It's been under 10 years, but even since then, I've seen it evolve so much, both like within gyms and outside of it, seeing what's popular and, the difference in styles between somebody who's been doing it for 15 years versus, 10 years versus even 5 years, like the stuff that some of these blue and purple belts are coming up with. I'm like, what the heck? Like, why didn't I learn that at the time? So yeah, it's very interesting to me how quickly grappling tends to evolve and all the differences that you can see.
One aspect of MMA grappling that's been changing that I don't know has followed over to sport jiu-jitsu is a lot of times, even though the back is exposed, they won't take the back initially. They're still going to constantly break them down onto their side or onto their back over and over and over, doing more leg rides and wrist rides until they're exhausted. And not only exhausted, but mentally wilted. And then you'll see somebody like Habib jump on their back and choke them out. Have you seen any of that transition over to sport jiu-jitsu where it's not all about all paths have to immediately go to the back?
Yeah, now that I'm thinking about it, I do see, I think, a lot more opportunities to take the back that are kind of just ignored. Whereas before, like you said, I think it was just instant. Like if you can see the back, you can take the back, go take it. But yeah, I think now I see a lot more people almost forcing their opponents back to the mat so they can spend more time in side control or transition them out. And yeah, break them down a bit or, hunt for submissions from the top instead of the back. Like you don't see, or I haven't at least seen nearly as many chokes from the back when the opportunity has definitely been there. But yeah, until you mentioned that, I haven't given a lot of thought about it. It's more just been like, why wouldn't you do that? The back was right there. I almost wonder how much of that, because I know there are a lot of gyms that specifically drill EBI rules, because there are a lot of tournaments out there, even local tournaments that will use EBI overtime and how, you can start in the back. And I think a lot of people are training for like very, very hard to, as soon as somebody gets your back, how do you get your shoulders to the mat? How do you get out of that? And so I wonder how much of that is knowing that if you take the back, then, people are much better, I think, at getting out of that position than they were in previous years. Because I know even since I've started, the focus on escaping back control has skyrocketed, and the techniques being taught to do that. I feel like there's a lot more. And again, just a lot more creativity in how to escape that position. So I'm not saying that has everything to do with it, but I'm just curious as to how much of that has just come from realizing that, people are better at escaping those positions now.
Yeah, that's the thing that people don't realize when they create tournament rules is it creates the conditions in which people will train under. And then that creates the type of jiu-jitsu for that era or going forward, right?
Yeah.
The IBJJF rules determine the game of Brazilian jiu-jitsu. And now Eddie Bravo's rules to try to smash IBJJF rules is actually now just becoming the new condition that people are learning how to train under. And it's also dictating how people train. Because if you're already going to get the back anyway in overtime, then why do you even need to learn how to get the back, right? It's more about once you have it, learning how to finish. And once somebody has your back, how to get out.
Yeah. There are definitely people who will wait, that is their game plan, is to wait for overtime just so that they can have easier access to those positions and finish from there. Which is another, I think, interesting. I don't know if it's for better or for worse, but it's certainly an interesting way that jiu-jitsu has developed over the past few years, I think.
Well, they just inadvertently created the same problems that soccer has.
Yeah.
Brazilian jiu-jitsu would know that if so many of them didn't pride themselves in never watching any other sports. Because if they watched other sports, they would know some of the hurdles that they've had to face and then be able to avoid those pitfalls. But the way soccer is, and that soccer people have complained about, is teams have learned to just drag it out and take it to overtime where it's 0-0 and then just win on the shootout.
Yeah.
Actually, it's another good reminder that you shouldn't just only watch your sport, because then you will make the same mistakes other sports make.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I've actually, I've recently gotten into watching volleyball. I blame Haiku for that.
Oh my God. I love that show.
I am obsessed. I'm wearing a Haiku jumper right now, actually. Sweater.
Nice.
Yeah, actually obsessed. But yeah, it actually got me into volleyball. And I have a friend on Twitter, actually, who we both do jiu-jitsu, but we've both gotten really into volleyball because of the anime. And yeah, I've never really been a fan of watching other sports, but just, it's been interesting. Like we, comparing, like we're such nerds, but we've been comparing the characters in that show and being like, how would that style translate to jiu-jitsu? Like how would, the setter, like what would their game look like in jiu-jitsu, and vice versa as well, like saying how would, a jiu-jitsu athlete go in volleyball and things like that. And so, yeah, I think it's interesting because that's not something I've done before, but analyzing other sports from a lens of MMA or jiu-jitsu and seeing what you could pick up from that.
I mean, those positions that you named only became positions because of the rules of volleyball. So in the same way, then Brazilian jiu-jitsu, the styles of play that you have, the games that people have, is all dictated by the rules.
Yeah. It's fascinating to me. And just, I think, jiu-jitsu people and MMA people, and I've fallen into that trap where it's just like, oh, I do this sport, so I'm only going to watch this sport. But yeah, like opening your mind up to other sports, I think can be beneficial, and like you said, seeing how the rules affect different positions and how they affect your style of play as well has been very interesting. Yeah.
So those EBI rules and trying to make it more exciting might also in some ways inadvertently create a stalling style of game, and everybody's looking to get to the shootout.
Yeah. And I think we've seen that in Submission Underground. It's been criticized recently for that, where the athletes were just waiting for overtime to capitalize on that. But yeah, it's a double-edged sword. We get more jiu-jitsu, but then sometimes people just wait for overtime.
Yeah. I mean, people ultimately just want to win, right? So
yeah,
if your main thing is to win, then you have to think about what are the avenues you're leaving open for winning. I think a lot of times, like, people don't test these ideas out because I think, like I said, they're not watching other sports, and a lot of these ideas might have been tested out in other sports. So it goes back to the weakness and the problems of being lone wolves, is they didn't like any of those team sports. Their whole thing is like, I'm just about jiu-jitsu, going back to that elitism. So then they're constantly reinventing the wheels that have been invented by other sports and then making the same mistakes those other sports have made needlessly, even though they've solved it. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is still trying to figure it out for the first time because they don't want to learn from anybody else.
Yeah.
Going back to our conversation about Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, it's interesting that there's going to be a light heavyweight fight between Paul Craig and Jamal Hill because it's a classic striker versus grappler match. And Paul Craig is like a submission specialist for light heavyweight, only because light heavyweight is really bad at submissions, which kind of makes me wonder, somebody like John Jones, can you consider him the greatest of all time if he's in a division where people can still do that kind of jiu-jitsu and still win a lot of fights? It's not a very good division.
Yeah, that's a good point. I guess you don't really see people grappling at the level that he is, that Paul Craig is.
Like a lot of his fights, he was getting beat up and then he fell and then they got into his guard and then got submitted by nothing even like interesting. Shows you where MMA grappling is at depending on the division. Like that could never happen in any of the lighter divisions.
Yeah. And I think, Paul's just like really good at, like we're talking about, like the bread and butter fundamental jujitsu. He's not doing anything special. He's good at what he does. He knows what he's good at, like he knows how to do submissions from guard. And like you said, that division just isn't very strong with grappling. You see a lot of strikers. But it's funny how, stuff that you think like, oh, it's just guard and then triangle, that's nothing special. That's nothing creative. That's not necessarily like ultra mega highlight reel stuff, but it's working because these guys don't see a triangle coming or don't know how to escape it or, don't know like, oh, I'm in someone's guard and it's good. What do I do from here?
That's why in a lot of ways, the old school versus new school jiu-jitsu argument is stupid because people training now are just so much better in general than people of the past. Not in every aspect. I gave the example about mount escape or different things like that. But in general, they are because they're used to submitting and beating people who know how to do Brazilian jiu-jitsu. Whereas people of the past, even like when I started in the 90s, so much of how good you were was a lot about being able to submit people who don't know anything about jiu-jitsu. I was often like grappling a karate guy, or like a kung fu guy who walked in the door. You didn't have higher belts. So being able to submit somebody who can't recognize an armbar or a triangle coming and feeling good about yourself about that is a lot different than somebody who knows it's coming and still able to catch it on them anyway. And so that is a generational difference. So people who got their black belt by mostly submitting people who didn't recognize those things is not nearly as impressive as people who were able to submit people and beat people who've been training since they were 15.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think we are, obviously now that jiu-jitsu is becoming a bit more popular, we're seeing more jiu-jitsu guys breaking into MMA or, MMA guys focusing more on jiu-jitsu. You do get a lot of matches or fights rather, where I guess I've been seeing more of people anticipating some jiu-jitsu moves before they happen. Where they're thinking a few steps ahead, but like you were saying, in some divisions, like that just doesn't exist as much. But and it's interesting how some people's jiu-jitsu is just so good that like you don't see. I mean, we see that on the mats all the time, but you definitely see that in MMA as well, where somebody thinks they have good fundamental jiu-jitsu, but the other guy's just better. Like it's as simple as that.
Yeah, I think especially in the past, you didn't really need to think that many steps ahead.
Yeah.
It wasn't like that. It was more about like toughness and like really trying to force that armbar or just being able to take it, even though they saw it coming. A lot of muscling, a lot of strength. Or you cooked them. It wasn't like thinking 12 moves ahead. I think that's more of a thing that's happening now.
Yeah, 100%.
All right. This was fun, Averi.
Yeah.
Thank you for coming on the show and chatting with us.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Sam. Like I said, it's a huge honor. I'm a big fan.
Where can people find you and your work?
Best place to find it now is just on the Jiu-Jitsu Times website. You can follow us on Facebook. We have an Instagram account. And if you just go to the website, you'll find a lot of my stuff there. If you want to follow me, it's just at BJJ Averi. My Twitter is mostly just incoherent ramblings, sometimes about jiu-jitsu, sometimes about anime, sometimes about whatever dumb thought decides to rattle around in my skull. But I'm always happy to chat with people about jiu-jitsu or anything else.
Now that's the show. If you enjoyed this episode and find this type of independent media worthwhile, please consider supporting the show on Patreon. We have a lot more episodes like this one in the works, but need your financial support to keep the show running. Even a few dollars a month goes a long way. No one does what we do, and it's all being funded by you, the listener. In return for supporting us, you'll gain access to lots of bonus content along with our private Discord chat. Even if you can't support us, there's a lot of free bonus content there as well. We also have an online store if you want to show your Southpaw solidarity by wearing our swag. You can find all pertinent links at southpawpod.com. And if you can't afford to support the show and still want to help, please leave us a 5-star review wherever you listen. This makes it easier for others to find us. And don't forget to share your favorite episodes or the podcast itself on social media. Tell your friends. Until next time, goodbye.
Southpaw. Hitting with the left. Southpaw. Sam. Paul. Southpaw. Southpaw.